Hello again, my friends, my students. This week we'll be talking about John Rawls and the original position. This lecture has been divided into two parts. Part 1 will discuss Rawls's methodology, his way of thinking about justice. And in Part 2, we'll discuss a little bit what principles of justice he actually thinks come out of this method of his. Now, Rawls's main book, A Theory of Justice, is concerned with one key question, or answering one key question, which is, how do you decide what fair terms of cooperation might be for people who see themselves as free and equal, but disagree about what makes life good? Rawls originates, or at least popularizes, a large number of key terms that will be familiar to almost any educated American from the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. These terms include the original position, the veil of ignorance, the principle of equal liberty, the difference principle, the basic structure, arbitrariness from a moral point of view, social justice, society as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. All of these phrases are percolating through our culture, through our newspapers, through op-eds, as educated people discuss amongst themselves what justice means for a free society. So the basic goal of this book is to answer this question about what the most appropriate conception of justice for specifying the fair terms of cooperation between citizens regarded as free and equal. Note here, Rawls is articulating a conception of justice. He understands that there's many conceptions of justice, but he's articulating one that is the most appropriate for citizens that regard themselves as free and equal. So what is justice for? The topic of justice for Rawls is a little bit different than the way it's been treated so far in our course by many of the authors that we've been reading. And if you haven't been taking this course, then understand that Rawls is distinctive and in many ways sets up a way of thinking about justice that continues to be very influential today. The topic of justice is the basic setup of a society's institutions, not individual interactions or even specific government policies. Or at least, if we're going to judge specific government policies as just or unjust, we have to understand the role that those policies play in the dynamic and complex environment of a society's broader institutions. And so he calls this basic setup the background institutions, or the basic structure of society. He assumes that we will be living in societies together and asks how this sort of non-voluntary arrangement, because after all, because Rawls assumes that we have to be living in some society or other, but at some level living in society itself is a non-voluntary thing. How can we live together and be free and equal under these circumstances? And how might these circumstances be made just? So Rawls introduces a term that's become very popular over the last half century or so, the term social justice, to refer to this justice of the background institutions. Now, not everybody means that when they're talking about social justice, but at least the way Rawls talks about it, when he talks about social justice, is we kind of take a step back. We don't look at specific actions by individuals. We don't look at specific laws or policies by governments. But what we do is we look at the sum total of benefits and burdens that people face in society, and ask ourselves whether those benefits and that bundle of benefits and burdens is just. So what is the basic structure? Well, the basic structure, or again, he uses two different terms for the same thing, the background institutions, is the set of social institutions like government, but also including the family, religions, culture, civil society, all of these social institutions that distribute rights and duties in society, as well as opportunities to succeed or fail. In other words, how well you do in society is going to depend how you are treated by this broad mix of social and political institutions. The basic structure ultimately influences our life chances by making the kinds of inequalities that we observe in life either especially burdensome or not too terribly painful. Let me give you an example. In some societies, being born blind might be a death sentence, right? Being born without eyesight might condemn you immediately to death, either through neglect or something more active than that. In other societies, being born blind could lead to a perfectly rewarding life. There are support structures in place that make the burden of blindness ultimately not as bad as it could be, right? The blindness is not what matters. Blindness, of course, is arbitrary from a moral point of view. We'll get to that, back to that term later. The real question is, how do the background institutions treat that blindness? That's what matters. How do you respond to this arbitrary occurrence, which is that somebody through extremely bad genetic luck was born without eyesight? So when we're thinking about the basic structure, when we think about justice, we need to be thinking about the basic structure, Rawls thinks. That's ultimately what matters. Remember, we said in the context of other authors, we said that often a question of justice arose when you're being treated, right? Justice arises when you're being treated in a particular way by somebody else. Here you have to imagine society as being the one that ultimately treats people, and society acts through various institutions, including families and the norms that govern families, governments, of course, with the legal rights and duties that come with being a citizen, as well as other organizations that might play a role, trade associations, unions, various what we would call NGOs, churches, of course, are great places for distributing benefits and burdens. And so when we're assessing whether somebody's fate in life is just or not, we have to look at the background institutions. We have to, so for example, if churches and families in a society are very supportive of the blind, that is to say, if churches and families see blindness not as some cosmic curse from the gods, as in some cultures, but see it as something that ultimately must be treated with compassion and with a desire to make the disability ultimately less impactful, then it's not clear how much social policy has to intervene, right? It's not clear how much the government has to do if other background institutions are already doing a lot. So when we consider whether a policy supporting the blind would be just or not, we have to look at the entirety of the situation of the blind with respect to all the institutions in society. If churches and families, on the other hand, treat blindness like some sort of curse or disease, then you may need some very active social policy to help blind people get what Rawls would call the full value of their liberties. So not just being left alone to be free to do whatever they want, but to be able to actually exercise their liberties in a meaningful way. So the point for Rawls and the point of social justice is that you're looking at the whole. You're not looking at the individual pieces. You're looking at the whole of society and showing how different institutions interact with one another in order to produce outcomes that are either fair and just or rather unfair and unjust. Now, for Rawls, social justice has another interesting feature that makes it really social. If you were to ask what justifies my being free to buy this big screen TV rather than to give that money to a homeless shelter or a battered women's organization, Rawls's answer would be something like, because the basic structure is just. In other words, if the basic structure is just, then, and only then, are individuals truly entitled to be free and do whatever they want with the resources that they have. But until justice is satisfied, then we always have to worry that some of the money, the property, or even the rights and the opportunities that we take advantage of, we really do so unjustly, right? We do so at the expense of others who, for a variety of reasons, might be more entitled to them than we are. So in other words, when everybody already has what they're due, then you can be free to spend and act as you wish. But your freedom, in some sense, is contingent upon justice actually being served. Now, the flip side of this view, of course, is that some people are not getting what they're due. Then we can't be confident that we have a strong claim to our own possessions and opportunities and rights. An unjust society, in other words, on this view, does not only affect those on the receiving end of the injustice. On the social justice view, things like pervasive racism affects everybody, or at least impacts everybody's rights. It's not just that people from a disfavored racial category aren't getting all of the rights and opportunities that they should get, but it's that someone else is probably getting too many, right? Someone else is benefiting from unearned and undeserved privileges that they are not, in fact, entitled to. So again, justice, or in this case, social justice, is a problem that affects everyone, right? Whereas under the old view of justice, it was quite possible for some people to not get what they were due, and other peoples to have exactly what they were due. In that sense, it was quite possible for, let's say that you, under the old view, you got cheated on a contract, your business partner cheated you. It would certainly be the case that you didn't get that your business partner would owe you something, but that just was about you two, right? It wasn't there weren't any broader ramifications to somebody not getting what they were due. Whereas on this view, we have to consider a much broader set of circumstances. Okay. Now, as I said right at the beginning of the lecture, Rawls has both a method of thinking about justice he thinks is the right way to understand social justice, and then he decides that there's two major principles of justice that he thinks can be derived from this method. The method in particular is called reasoning from the original position, and the principles that he gets from the original position are something that he calls the principle of equal liberty and the difference principle. Now, the method, and it's worth noting, it's worth separating these two things because I think a lot of people have been attracted to Rawls's method, but not particularly persuaded by his derivation of the two principles of justice that he ultimately thinks should regulate the basic structure of society. And other people are very attracted to the two principles that he has, but aren't really persuaded that his particular method of thinking about justice is the most solid way of justifying those two principles. So, making the distinction has more than one purpose, more than just to divide this lecture into two pieces. It also helps you sort out your thoughts when you're thinking about Rawls. Do you accept the method more or less, but don't necessarily accept the principles? Do you accept the method and accept the principles? Do you reject the method and reject the principles? Or you could reject the method, but still quite like the principles that he comes up with at the end of the day. In any event, Rawls thinks that the way to think about justice is as a set of moral principles that rational and reasonable people would agree to in a fair bargain, back to a kind of contractarianism, right? Except in this case, Rawls wants to be very sure that the bargain is fair, right? Now, to figure out what principles of justice society should adopt, we need to use our imagination. We can't just go ask people what they think would be just, because people themselves are full of biases influenced by all kinds of factors that are arbitrary from a moral point of view. So Rawls says rich people are naturally going to favor principles that favor the rich. Poor people are naturally going to favor principles that favor the poor. White people are going to favor principles that maybe do some ignoring of historical injustices, whereas perhaps African descendants of African slaves, rather, in the United States favor principles that would presumably benefit their current status. And so Rawls thinks we need to be able to get out of that way of thinking. We need to sort of try to find a way to eliminate these biases. And so he comes up with a thought experiment. Right? He comes up with a hypothetical thought experiment that he thinks would yield us principles that are truly fair and truly just. Rather, what he comes up, I should be more specific about that. He comes up with a hypothetical situation that he thinks is perfectly fair, and because it's perfectly fair, the contractors in that bargain would come up with principles that themselves are just, right? So only by the use of our imagination can we discover what the appropriate principles of justice for human beings are, right? And so he comes up with this idea of the original position. And the original position, I think, at this most simple, basic level, is a device for producing principles of justice, right? It's a kind of machine, right? It's a machine into which you feed some data, and the machine then cranks out principles of justice based on the inputs that you insert into the machine. The original position, like I said, is a hypothetical bargaining situation where free, equal, and self-interested rational persons who have no idea whatsoever of their position in society, or what their natural talents and abilities are, or what their race is, or what their gender is, or what their disability status is, they meet and they bargain over what principles of justice to adopt for real society. In other words, they don't know where they're going to end up in society, but they face the task of trying to figure out what principles would be just for real people, who will then end up in society. So the participants are said to be behind a veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance is this device to simulate the lack of information that these contractors will have about their ultimate fate in society, what their ultimate status is going to be, rich or poor, black or white, disabled or not disabled, sexual preference, etc., etc. They don't know what they're going to be, right? They just have to come up with rules in advance for the range of circumstances that society could possibly find themselves in. And those rules, ideally, would be ones that they consent to. And if they consent to those rules, not knowing where they would end up, then we can assume that the rules would be just, or as just as we can possibly make them. These people are, the information they don't have is the information that Rawls thinks is ultimately morally arbitrary. Things that ultimately people receive in life that they don't deserve or earn, right? So their gender, their sexual preferences, their race, the socioeconomic status of their parents. These are all things that they would not know behind the veil of ignorance, because these are things that ultimately, from a moral point of view, in terms of what people should get in society, in terms of what rights and liberties they should have, these are things that don't matter, right? These are things that ultimately, by themselves, don't matter as to how well people should fare, or how poorly people should fare, for that matter, in society. So they don't know those things in advance. And because they don't know those things in advance, they can't use those features about them to bias their arguments as they make a decision and try to decide what principles of justice they should adopt for those future people, or for themselves, really, in the future. Rawls is particularly concerned about two possible kinds of morally arbitrary features about society. These are the sorts of things that have in the past, in real-world societies, created a whole lot of feelings of injustice, right? Inequality stemming from environmental advantages. So environmental advantages will be the things that the conditions under which you're born. Are you born in a rich neighborhood or a poor neighborhood? Are you born to rich parents or poor parents? Are you born into a zip code that has a lot of amenities, or a zip code that has not many amenities, right? Are you born, I mean, if you were to extend this internationally, and Rawls doesn't, are you born in a rich country or a developing country, right? These inequalities stemming from environmental advantages, Rawls thinks you're not entitled to take credit for the achievements of your parents, for example. You're not entitled to take credit for the zip code where you were born or where you grew up, because these things ultimately are not things that are properly yours. And similarly, in the case of natural talents, Rawls wants to ultimately create a counterbalance to the genetic lottery, right? Some people are born with lots of talents, both physical, intellectual, temperamental, and others are not. Others are born with various levels of disability, with various levels of ability, and as a result, that will affect how they fare. But Rawls thinks these things are things that happen to you. These aren't things that are meaningful from a moral perspective. They produce good and bad consequences for you, but ultimately, these are not the things that people should be penalized for. People shouldn't be penalized for receiving a bad hand or a bad draw in the card game of life, if you will. So these inequalities, Rawls thinks, are undeserved and unearned, and yet they affect life chances. For that reason, he calls them arbitrary from a moral point of view. They're neither good nor bad. They just are. The task of society, of course, is to create just rules in response to the variety of conditions that society can face. A perfectly just society, therefore, in a perfectly just society, Rawls thinks that things like gender just wouldn't matter. They wouldn't have any effect on our chances of living a good life. Similarly with your race, the color of your skin would matter not a jot when it comes to your chances of living a good or a bad life, Rawls thinks. And so as a result, it's not something you should know about yourself in advance. Therefore, when you make rules about things like affirmative action and hate crimes and hate speech, you're not allowed to know whether you're going to be on the receiving end or potentially on the giving end. It's just not for you to know that. So you need to make a rule that ultimately you would accept, presumably, if you were on the receiving end, right? Given that there's a chance that you might end up in a category that's going to be discriminated against for various reasons, you should probably create rules that make that not so bad. Again, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, but that's his idea. So for Rawls, what do the people know, right? What do people know? Well, they know what society is like. So behind the veil of ignorance, they have some idea of how the world works. They know a lot of social science. You could imagine in Rawls's ideal hypothetical situation, people don't know anything about the morally arbitrary feature about themselves, but they know a lot about how the world works. They know a lot about how racist people can get. They know a lot about how sexist people can get. They know a lot about the workings of the economy, how capitalism works, and how socialism works, and how other kinds of isms work. So you could imagine them as they've boosted their general education knowledge, right? But they're completely cut off from knowledge about themselves and where they're going to end up. That's kind of the setup. And furthermore, Rawls says people understand very well that society is a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. I think this is one of the most interesting parts of Rawls in some ways, that he sees society as a positive sum game, right? If we're lucky, we are born and live in societies where people cooperate with one another and create surplus over and above what people could do just working on their own. So contractors may be rational and self-interested, but they understand that society can produce benefits for everyone as long as everybody adheres to a stable framework of rules, and those rules are enforced. So in that sense, Rawls seems to understand the idea of prisoners' dilemmas and various kinds of cooperative games and collective action dilemmas that societies face. And of course, the task is to come up with fair principles that will help regulate social cooperation in a way that preserves the rational self-interest of all parties to the bargain, no matter what their race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or social origins turn out to be. Okay. This idea of social cooperation is interesting because I think the way Rawls understands it is kind of like Hobbes. So if we're all acting on our own, getting what we can, as rational, self-interested maximizers, we're going to end up in a pretty dark place, or at least a pretty inconvenient place, right? We know that social cooperation through rules enforced by government, Rawls thinks, this is part of what makes political science relevant to Rawls, not just philosophy, is that social cooperation using politics creates a kind of surplus of wealth above and beyond what could be achieved with anarchy. So politics is, in part, a way of cooperating together to produce more wealth and more other types of goods like security, freedom, and happiness, than we could each achieve acting on our own. And so, in this way, for Rawls, politics is about serving the interests we all share together. It's about taking care of those interests that we all have, because, of course, as Hobbes would say, nobody wants to end up in anarchy. But because this social cooperation produces extra benefits, and because the cooperation of all members of society, everybody has to play by the rules at some level for the benefits to materialize, politics is therefore going to be in part become a matter of how to distribute the profits from this venture that we're all engaged in. So in that sense, the reason why some people can make a lot of money being a doctor, for example, is that a lot of other people, is that first of all, contracts with doctors can be enforced, so they can collect fees. It's also presumably because there's a certification process that exists to make sure that doctors that aren't very good are weeded out from the profession, right? And so all of this is sort of this cooperation dividend, you might call it, is the extra benefits that politics gives us. Politics gives each and every one of us, including doctors, but including every one of us. And again, we all have a part to play, if only just for obeying the law, right? Everybody needs to obey the law for some of these goods to exist. Everybody has to pay their taxes, or at least enough people have to pay their taxes. Everybody has to obey the rules of the road, traffic regulations, right? As long as everybody plays by the rules, there's some cooperative benefit to be had. But of course, the distribution of these profits, everybody wants a bigger share of the distribution of the profits of social cooperation. So in that sense, politics is not just about what we share, the interest that we share, but also about a conflict of interests about what to do with these profits. Some of us will want them put to one use, others will want them to be put to another use. The point that Rawls is making, I think, is that these profits is that we're involved in games of both cooperation and conflict, and we need principles to decide justly how to distribute the profits of social cooperation. And those rules won't be just if they're influenced by our knowledge ahead of time about our likely position in the distribution of benefits and burdens in society. Okay. So what principles, ultimately, does Rawls think we should use to assess the justice of our basic structure or background institutions? Stay tuned. That's the subject for part 2.